New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you. I'm Reverend Victoria Bomberry, and I'm coming to you from Riverside, California. And I am just thrilled to be here this Saturday morning with you to have a conversation about the Science of Mind textbook. And we love having conversations. So if you are with us on online right now, please join in and ask any questions or make comments so we can incorporate it into this wonderful conversation that we're having. And last week we had Reverend Robert Brzezinski, and next week we'll have Reverend Laura Topper. And I'm right in the middle of that, and we are working with Chapter 20, What the Mystics Have Taught. And I have a little kitty cat here who's meowing, so she may join us at some point in this conversation. And, you know, I love this chapter for a number of reasons, because I think that Science of Mind is truly grounded in the mystical. And what is a mystic? You know, what does that mean? And a mystic is someone who really is receptive to God, you know, is receptive to receiving all that God has, you know, and becoming one. So there's that unitive process that is right at the center of mysticism. And that's what mysticism is. And, you know, one of the things that I always love about religious science is that, you know, Ernest Holmes was a mystic. He had that receptivity and that attunement to spirit. And he was, as he said, everyone could be a revealer of truth. And the truth is the truth is the truth at all times. It's always the truth. So this is the legacy that we're working with in religious science. We do have that kind of atmosphere where we are receptive to spirit. That's what we're working toward when we do all of our spiritual practice, is to become receptive to spirit in the most powerful way that we possibly can. So a mystic, according to Ernest Holmes, I love this first paragraph at the beginning of the chapter. A mystic is not a mysterious person, but one who has a deep inner sense of life and with his unity of the whole. So that wholeness that we talk about is the whole of creation, the whole of the visible and the invisible, right? So it's everything. So the mystic has a sense of that. And, you know, for most of us, I think it's an innate quality that everyone has, that we have a sense of it. And that's what sparks our yearning to to go deeper into it for those who choose to do it. Other people may have a glimpse of it or maybe kind of an inkling that something is there, but they're distracted. They're doing other things and they don't follow this path of the mystic. And yet in religious science, I think that's the atmosphere that we have. We want to go deeper. We want to really explore what wholeness means and its totality. And, we can spend many lifetimes doing that because we're looking at the infinite. There's always something to discover and to find. And, in this first part of the chapter, which I thought was very interesting, is that Ernest Holmes makes a real distinction between mysticism and psychism and, like psychics. So I thought that this is a very interesting take that he has. And let me just read this. Mysticism and psychism are entirely different. One is real, while the other may or may not be an illusion. There is nothing mysterious in truth, so far as it is understood, and it is capitalized. So that is the divinity, the sacred, that truth that is behind everything that we see. But all things seem mysterious until we understand them. So mysticism, I think sometimes we'll see pictures of a mystic and they do look mysterious. Some of the illustrations that we have are, they make the figure of the mystic be very, they look just mysterious. I think he's absolutely correct in that. But, anyone can be a mystic, anyone. And I remember when I was a teenager and someone told me, "Oh, she's a mystic." And I was like, "Really?" And I was really wondering what on earth can a mystic be? And I was looking at this woman and she looked just like a young mother. She had 5 children and I thought, "Wow, that's what mystics look like." And she was beautiful, and so I had this image of a mystic as a woman, really just ensconced in life, right? Who was raising a family, who was a mother, a spouse, young and vibrant and all of that. So, I kind of got a different idea very young about who and what a mystic might be. And the mysterious part of her was she was someone, to me, the mysterious part was that she was someone who just seemed to know. And it came naturally to her, it seemed, to just know and to be present. And, I thought she was just I guess I kind of, looked up to her a lot, because she seemed to be such a presence and very, very astute and just there all the time. So that was my idea from a very young age of a mystic. And he goes on to say, a mystic is one who intuitively perceives truth without mental process. Okay, so we're taking that mental process out, the intellectualization of the thought process that is the human, that part of the human anatomy, where we have a thought process that's processing information. So the mystic perceives truth directly without going through that thought process. It is from the teachings of the great mystics that the best in philosophy of the world has come. Who was there who could have taught such men as these. But what process of mentality did they, by what process of mentality did they arrive at their profound conclusions? We are compelled to recognize that spirit alone was their teacher. They were indeed taught by God. And, before we make that too mysterious, let's kind of think about that a little bit, what that might mean. And, I want to give an example. Sometimes you might be engrossed in something. And by that, I mean, you're not really thinking about it necessarily. You are just there with it. And there's some sort of something happens, and suddenly you are in the flow of spirit, right? You're in that flow. And, the only way that you can, you're probably not aware of it when you're there in terms of when it starts or anything, but it just happens. And it's almost as if time stops. You're fully engrossed in it. And things that may have seemed very difficult to comprehend or even go through suddenly just flow through you. And that's been called by a number of things. And I think that flow is as good of a word as any, because it captures the feeling of it. I think you're in the flow. And I think this is what he's getting at. And sometimes people can call them peak experiences. Sometimes an athlete will get into that be that receptive, and all at once every part of their body is working at its optimum without even trying. There's not that ex- necessarily that exertion of trying. It's just in the flow when things are happening automatically, because you are in complete cooperation with the divine. So I think this is what he's getting at and explaining to us in this first couple of paragraphs. Our great religions have been given by a few who climbed the heights of spiritual vision and caught a fleeting glimpse of ultimate reality. No living soul could have taught them what they knew. Ah. Now, who are our teachers? What do they teach us? Well, I think that most of the great teachers are pointing the way. They're not really teaching, they're just pointing the way. And sometimes we get caught up in who they might be. Jesus is one of those teachers that, I think was an enlightened being and one of those masters, a spiritual master. And, we've kind of, in the West, Jesus has kind of become the only the only way, right? And yet I think that Jesus would have been a little taken aback by that, because he was just pointing the way, and he made sure that people knew that. And when he made claims, he wasn't making those claims as Jesus the man. He was making those claims as uh, that one who was unified with the divine and felt that unity in in every moment. I think that Jesus was pretty tied in to the sacred in every moment of his life. There was no difference. He was completely aware that there was no separation between the divine and him. And of course, he said that everyone had that ability. And he gathered disciples together to show the way, to say, this is a path that all humanity can take. It's not for the select few. It's not just for me. It's something that is available to everyone. So this is, tapping into that ultimate reality in the same way that Jesus did. And he also goes on to say in the next paragraph, the great poets have been true mystics who through their poems have revealed the presence of God, like Robert Browning. So he's just naming his favorite poets, Tennyson, Wordsworth, Homer, Walt Whitman, Edward Rowland Sill, and others of like nature have given us poetry which is immortal because they had a spiritual sense of life. And, some of the people that he is naming, like Robert Browning, we would consider him one of the romantic poets. And, one of the things that is a hallmark of the romantic poems is their deep connection with nature and just finding that divinity within nature. So I think that's what he's speaking to. And he's talking about Browning and Wordsworth. And then when he gets to Walt Whitman, we have someone who, a 19th century poet who was just so interesting and a pivotal figure in letters, because he kind of may have had some aspects of transcendentalism in him, the transcendental poets, the writers, and yet he had a foot in another, well, I'll call it a dimension, had a foot in another dimension. And I'm just going to say another era, where he was stepping into a more modern era, more 20th century kind of mindset in terms of who we are as humanity and where he was headed in his own life. Even so, he was a visionary. He was definitely a visionary and someone who tapped into something that was on its way, a kind of consciousness that was on its way into the world, but especially in this particular locale of North America. And when he was writing, he was not considered well, people were not very happy with him often. And oh, shoot. I'm trying to get a poem up, but for some reason it is not working. But I wanted to just point out that Walt Whitman, as a visionary, had a sense of himself, and Song of Myself, which is one of his greatest poems and is recognized as one of, a masterpiece. He really looked at individuality. And, this was just coming to the fore around in the 19th century. What does being an individual mean? And of course, Ernest Holmes spent a lot of time with individuality. And, it's kind of interesting because in the United States, individuality has become kind of a iconic and kind of the myth of individuality. And how can I put this the best way? It was something that was emerging, right? That people were empowered and could create their lives, that they had that ability. So at that moment of that recognition of individuality, it was incredibly important at that moment. However, as that hardened into the myth of individuality, people started disconnecting from one another. And I think this is where Walt Whitman is so important, because he could see that individuality was important, and yet he stayed grounded in the whole. When he talked about, when he was writing in Song of Myself, he made it clear that he was talking about himself, but he was completely and totally a part of all life. In that individuality, he was that divine essence expressing itself. And he was also completely connected to all of life. So when he's writing in this poem about lying on the grass and, being a part of the grass as well, he can find himself in that blade of grass. He was expressing this deep mystical union that all mystics of the ages have apprehended. So Ernest Holmes, uses him as one of those poets who was able to connect in this very powerful way. And you can choose any one of your favorite poets and generally find something to this effect that people connect in that way. They're in the flow. They get at those truths. You may be a lover of Rumi. You may be a lover of Hafiz, and you'll find that same quality in their poetry. It's kind of out of time. It's not necessarily only a product of their particular era. It goes beyond that particular era and enters the infinite. So, I love poetry. I enjoy it. I think that there is great truth that comes through poetry that cannot come in any other way. So I'm so sorry that I can't read this poem to you right now, but maybe I'll be able to go back to it in a few moments. So he gives us a sense. There's poets who are mystics. He also says great spiritual philosophers are mystics. So I think one of the people that has kind of gained ascendancy again in a lot of circles is Meister Eckhart. And so we would look at that spiritual philosopher, Meister Eckhart, as a mystic. The old prophets were mystics: David, Solomon, Jesus, Plotinus, and some others. All had the same experience, a sense of universal living presence. Gee, can't see this morning. I better put my glasses on. So they have that sense of living presence. And, that's true of the poets as well. The greatest music ever composed was written by the hand of a mystic. And the highest and best in art has come from people of spiritual perception. So this is what I was getting at before with people who get into that flow. They're connecting, and we might say it's intuition, that spiritual part of us that connects to living presence as spiritual perception. So he goes on in the next paragraph to talk about all the things that human beings have constructed in this world. And, and this is what I'm talking about too. all of the things that can be kind of distractions, building, harnessing electricity, capturing the wind. I mean, he goes through this entire list of things that human beings have been constructing, and of course, they've raised the standard of living in terms of comfort level and all of that. And yet, one of the things that he points out, and this is an important point, is that in doing all of this, we're distracted from that which is most important, and that is understanding our own souls, and cultivating that soul, awakening to our own souls. And, one of the things that I think that we are all called to do, that he points out, is that we are, in exploring our souls, understanding that there is an indwelling, living presence in every person. And also, I think we can extend that even further to know that there is that indwelling, living presence in all of creation. It doesn't, we're not the sole recipients of that indwelling presence. And we're finding that out through science. Just recently, I was reading an article about insects. And, sometimes we're very careless about how we treat insects. And we're having a grand exodus of the biodiversity of the insect world globally. And, we've been very cavalier about it. And yet, science is finding that insects have a profound emotional life and a feeling life. And, so we can't really detach ourselves from any part of life. There is something that is like us in them, and that is the sacred. And they all have their particular niches to fill, and they have the things that they do to make this planet habitable and productive and beautiful for all of us. So as we discover more, we find that indwelling presence in more places, and with empirical evidence, right? So we are not the only recipients. We are a part of this whole that we are taught by the great mystics of the entire world, who knew, who had different aspects of it and taught different aspects of it. And yet we're kind of bringing all of this together now in our era. We're finding out that, yes, science supports this. Yes, our spirituality supports science. And here we are in that flow. And as we're in the flow, we get those eternal truths that cultivate and activate and awaken our souls to that ultimate reality that is life. Now, he goes on to, make some distinctions between psychism and mysticism. And I think this is interesting because if we think about when Ernest Holmes was a young man, there was, a tremendous interest in spiritualism, and that kind of grew up very strong. And there's a lot of reasons that people believe that it could have become so strong, especially after the First World War, right in that time. So when he's writing, when he's doing a lot of this work and speaking, he's right in the middle of that. And, of course, there were people who, I think had, true gifts in this area. And he's navigating through this. and making a distinction between mystics and psychics. And what he says is that the mystic does not read human thought, but rather he senses the atmosphere of God. Okay, so the distinction between the mystic and the psychic is that the psychic deals with human thought. So the mystic does not read human thought, but senses the atmosphere of God. So in that atonement or at one-ment, there's that connection, that strong unification, that unitive act that the mystic engages in. On the other hand, the psychic, in sitting with someone, is reading that person and reading the human thought in that. So we can see how that could be valuable, right? And helpful to people, and getting a handle on what might be going on with them psychologically, or maybe even, things that are going on in their body. And yet, Ernest Holmes is pointing to something that is even higher. And at that time, as I said, there was a lot of interest in this, in psychics and spiritualism. And after World War I, when people lost, so many people were killed, and it was something that hadn't been seen on a global level. The killing and the death and the destruction and all of that. Nothing like that had ever been seen before. And people were, searching and so hurt and wounded and, completely traumatized by the events of that war, that they were reaching for any way that they could connect with their lost loved ones. So spiritualism was on the rise. That psychism was on the rise to address that. And out of that arose many different strains of psychism, and a lot of charlatans emerged out of that, and who just took advantage of people. And I think this is what he is navigating and teaching in, to go deeper. Don't get mired into the, just looking at the human thought. Go to the source, right? Go to source for answers. Don't be distracted by the human thought and the human emotions that may, keep you in one place. Go to source. So I think, this is how I'm reading it and interpreting it as I look through this. And I want to mention too that Dr. Jennifer Vest has written a book. She's a medical intuitive, called The Ethical Psychic. And, I think it addresses many of these same sorts of issues, and lays a groundwork for, being ethical in anyone who is gifted in this area. So, I think that, this is not to denigrate those gifts. This is just a recognition that there can be abuse, and of course there can be abuse in any area. But this is the area that Ernest Holmes was navigating when he was doing his speaking and writing. So, and he also says that, because a psychic is dealing with the subjective thought of other humans, that vibration can actually influence them, right? And, this is why it's so important to him that we go to source. So on page 329, he writes, the teaching of the mystics has been that There should be conscious courting of the divine presence. There should be conscious receptivity, and I've said this already, to it, but a balanced one. As one of the apostles said in substance, that he would rather speak 10 words with his understanding than 10,000 with confusion. God is the, and this is a quote, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. The great mystics have been intensely and preeminently sane, sound people. And maybe, in their time, maybe they weren't considered that. Walt Whitman definitely was not considered a sane, sound person. But, he was connected, and he was seeing things as they are. And for a lot of people, when someone sees things as they truly are, that can look like it's so different than the run-of-the-mill scene that it can seem like it is unbalanced or not sane. So I want to go. He uses Jesus a lot, of course, and sometimes we kind of leave out Jesus and in our teachings in our centers sometimes, because I think that many people have not approached the teachings of Jesus in a way that I believe Jesus taught. Like I said, Jesus was a way shower, an example, not an exception, and could be a savior in the sense that his teachings and way showing save people from their ways of apprehending the presence. And yet he would not claim to be the savior. That is not, I don't believe that is what he would have ever claimed to be. And, Ernest Holmes talks about Jesus a lot. He says in the last paragraph on 329, Jesus taught a power transcendent, triumphant, absolute, positive, against which lesser laws meant nothing. By its very presence, it heals. The mystics did not contend or argue with people. There was nothing to argue about. They saw and knew. They are the great revealers to humanity of the nature of the universe and the relationship of humanity to God. Oh, and isn't that powerful? By its very presence, it heals. So anytime that we are able to be in that flow, to see the ultimate reality, that is healing in and of itself. There's nothing to argue about. There's nothing to get all upset about, because this is the truth, right? You can't argue with it. It's absolute. It's not a point that you're working toward. It is the truth right here, right now. It's always been this way. It always will be this way. You don't have to arrive at it. You're there, right? And that's what we talk about when we talk about that inner presence. We don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to do anything other than awaken to that inner presence. And I want to go on to this next unit around unity. All of it is present at any and every point within itself. Okay, I've already done this. And he goes on to say, this concept enabled Job to say, In my flesh shall I see God. Oh my goodness, isn't that refreshing to know that in Scripture that there is not any separation here. Job says, "In my flesh shall I see God." In this incarnation, we can see God, right? There's nothing wrong with this flesh. This flesh is holy, and we can see God. All life is bound together by one common law of love, and love is self-givingness of spirit. And I always love it when Ernest Holmes says this: love is the self-givingness of spirit. Oh, yeah, I always just have to breathe that in, that spirit is always giving to us of itself. We have that. We have all of that. That just fills me up every time I hear it, to know that that self-givingness never stops. It's always giving. And it's the self that we have. And, he writes in big capital letters, we must unify in our own mentalities with pure spirit. We can write that up. I think that I'm going to write that and put it up on my mirror for a while. We must unify in our own mentalities with pure spirit. And, if I get up and I'm grouchy one morning, I'm going to look at that and say, yes, that's where I want to be. That's the place where flow happens. That's the place where we are unified with God. And on page 331, Ernest Holmes gives us the steps of treatment down in the last paragraph. The power of Jesus is understood when we study his method of procedure. Consider his raising of Lazarus from the dead. Standing at the tomb, he gave thanks. This was recognition. He next said, I know that thou hearest me always. This was unification. Then he said, Lazarus, come forth. This was command, or what we call realization. This method is perfect, and we shall do well to follow it. This method can be used in all treatment. First, realize that divine power is, then unify with it, and then speak the word as one having authority. For the law is the servant of eternal spirit throughout all ages. So we get clear instructions in this paragraph about how to do treatment and why it works, and why the example of Jesus is important to us even now, right? We still use that. That is a procedure, that is tried and true method. And individuality is the next section. And I'm going to go to page 333. And, I think these are good instructions for us. And I'm going to leave us with this. And, I want to encourage you to go through and read this entire chapter, because it is just so full and so wonderful, and it talks about individuality, and then it goes on to talk about illumination. But I want to leave us with this. From now on, we shall expand, grow, and express only to the degree that we consciously cooperate with the whole. And I think that this is important, especially now for us at this moment, our historical moment, because we have, over the years, gotten into this very individualistic way of being in the world. Now, that's great, right? It's great for us to understand that we are individuals with individuality and gifts, individual gifts to bring to the world. But, we've kind of taken it to an extreme where we've forgotten that we are a part of the whole as well. That yes, we develop as individuals, and yet we must recognize that we are part of the whole. We don't exist independently. We are dependent on every other part of this whole for our being, right? Our beingness. So right now, we're called to come back into that consciousness of the whole. The consciousness, and we can start with our own planet, right? The consciousness that, yes, everything any individual does has a direct effect on the whole. And, that's what our teachings tell us, that we have to be right with God in order to live a life of abundance, of plenty, of harmony, all of those things. That is what we are called to do, to recognize our own individuality, work on solidifying our ability to enter into that flow and to be in the atmosphere of God. That's what we do. That's our spiritual work. So that as we are in the world, as the great mystics were, we are contributing to this harmony and peace that is the natural state of creation. There's a lot of dynamics going on, but they are harmonized. And when they aren't harmonized, they will come back into harmony because of law. And we want to bring all of these strands together to work in the best way possible at all times, because they will come back. We may have to pay some heavy duty prices, but they will come back into that harmony and plenty and that balance. So this week, everyone, have a wonderful week. And just remember, we all have that mystic at the center of us. We all have that capability of connecting to the whole and to source. And we are all those noble beings that the Buddha talked about. Those, that idea that ye are all gods, right? Which is a strong statement, right? That comes from, I think that comes from Acts or Psalms, one of those very poignant scriptures. And we have that ability to be at one-ment. And, I think that we can say that's what atonement is, at one-ment. So have a wonderful week. Love to everyone.
Please help us say thank you to our organizational sponsors and donors, including the Hefferland Foundation, Affiliated New Thought Network, International New Thought Alliance, Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation, Center for Spiritual Living Denver, Center for Spiritual Living Midtown Atlanta, New Thought Philadelphia, Planned Happiness Institute, Summit Center for Spiritual Living, Center for Spiritual Living on the Lake, Unity Spiritual Center, Kitchener, Om Center for Spiritual Living, Center for Spiritual Living, North Jersey, Unity of Savannah, Center for Spiritual Living, Seattle, and all of our individual donors and sponsors. Thank you for being a part of the New Thought Media Network. Please come be you.